The narrative arc of Clementine Churchill, the woman who would eventually become the invisible structural integrity behind the colossal Churchillian legend, begins not in the comfort of Victorian stability, but in the crucible of aristocratic precariousness and profound destabilizing social ambiguity. Born on April 1, 1885, at 75 Grosvenor Street in Mayfair, London, into the socially elite, yet financially and emotionally bankrupt Churchill family, Clementine was forged in an environment defined by scandal, insecurity, and the terrifying whim of her parents' acrimonious separation. Her legal father, Sir Henry Churchill, was a harsh, unyielding, and often absent man who later served as Secretary of Lloyd's of London, but who eventually divorced her mother, Lady Blanche, leaving the family in a precarious financial position that bordered on destitution by the standards of the British peerage. Her mother, Lady Blanche Ogilvy, was a notorious gambler and a woman of capricious, often cruel moods who navigated society on the edge of ruin, dragging her children through a chaotic upbringing defined by sudden moves to avoid creditors and the constant threat of social ostracization. The paternity of Clementine herself was a subject of persistent, whispered gossip in London society, with credible historical rumors suggesting her biological father was actually the dashing Captain William Bay Middleton, famous horseman and lover of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, or perhaps Lord Ridsdale, the grandfather of the famous Mitford sisters. This persistent cloud of illegitimacy followed her like a shadow, instilling a deep-seated, almost pathological need for respectability, legitimacy, and order that would define her adult life. Clementine spent her formative years moving between rented rooms in the French seaside town of Dieppe, where she learned fluent French and witnessed the raw edges of life and the charity of reluctant relatives like the Ogilvys at Cortecky Castle, living in a state of genteel poverty that instilled in her a lifelong paralyzing anxiety about money and a steely, pragmatic resilience. She also suffered the trauma of losing her beloved elder sister, Kitty, to typhoid fever in 1900, a tragedy that hardened her resolve to survive and made her fiercely protective of those she loved. She learned early that in her world, survival depended on vigilance and the ability to read the changing winds of fortune, traits that would later prove indispensable in the chaotic world of high politics. This background made her the antithesis of the young Winston Churchill, a man born into the Baroque splendors of Blenheim Palace, grandson of a duke, possessed of a boundless, often reckless confidence and a sense of destiny that bordered on the messianic. When they first properly met at a dinner party in March 1908, seated next to each other by the astute hostess Lady St. Helier, the pairing appeared on paper to be a disastrous mismatch. The shy, intellectual, and deeply cautious girl versus the loud, stuttering, and bombastic politician who had already managed to alienate half of Parliament with his floor-crossing antics and arrogant demeanor. However, the connection that sparked between them was not merely romantic, but profoundly intellectual and strategic. Winston, often surrounded by sycophants, or those who dismissed him as an erratic eccentric, found in Clementine a mind that could not only keep pace with his relentless monologues, but could also challenge, refine, and ground them. Clementine, conversely, saw beneath the bluster a fragile genius that required a steady hand to guide it. Their union was less a traditional marriage and more the formation of a high-stakes partnership, where her calculated reserve became the essential counterbalance to his manic energy, creating a dynamic equilibrium that would eventually sustain them through 2 world wars and the reshaping of the global order. Before we continue our deep dive into the untold story of the strategist who saved the savior of the Western world, please take a moment to engage with our channel. Creating these comprehensive, long-form historical documentaries requires significant research, time, and effort, and your support is the fuel that keeps this engine running. If you are finding value in this analysis and want to see more content that goes beyond the surface level of history to explore the psychological depths of its key figures, please hit that like button. It sends a crucial signal to the algorithm to share this history with more people. Make sure you are subscribed and have the notification bell turned on so you never miss an installment of our biography series. And most importantly, share this video with a friend, a colleague, or a history study group. The story of Clementine Churchill is one that deserves to be known by everyone who studies leadership. Thank you for your support. Now, let's return to the turbulent world of British politics. Immediately upon her marriage at St. Margaret's, Westminster in September 1908, Clementine was thrown into the brutal gladiatorial arena of Edwardian politics, a world where reputation was currency and a single misstep could end a career. She quickly realized that to survive, she had to shed her innate shyness and transform herself into a fierce protector and a ruthless gatekeeper. Winston Churchill was a man of immense talent but catastrophic judgment regarding people. He was easily dazzled by flattery, prone to trusting the wrong advisers like the flamboyant Admiral Fisher or the cunning press baron, Lord Beaverbrook, and frequently blinded by his own enthusiasm for grand, impractical schemes. Clementine became his eyes and ears, utilizing a terrifyingly sharp intuition, her famous bullshit detector, to scan the social and political horizon for threats. She did not merely host dinner parties. She curated them as strategic operations, filtering out the spies, the opportunists, and the fair-weather friends who sought to exploit Winston's influence for their own gain. She sat in the gallery of the House of Commons for hours, analyzing the mood of the room, the reactions of his rivals like David Lloyd George and Bonar Law, and the reception of his speeches, providing him with brutal, unfiltered post-game analysis that no paid consultant would dare offer. She even experienced the physical dangers of politics firsthand, notably when she was attacked by a suffragette at a train station in Bristol in 1909. She responded with physical courage, grappling with the attacker to protect her husband from being shoved onto the tracks. She understood the unspoken codes of the British aristocracy and the rising power of the working class better than he did, often restraining his more self-destructive impulses. When Winston, in a fit of pique, would draft a venomous letter to a prime minister or a crucial ally, it was Clementine who would intercept it, arguing him down over breakfast or rewriting it entirely to preserve the relationship. She was the secret strategist who ensured that his brilliance was not extinguished by his own lack of tact, proving that while Winston had the booming voice to command the room, Clementine possessed the silent intelligence to control the narrative. The resilience of this partnership faced its first existential threat during the catastrophic Gallipoli campaign of World War I in 1915. A strategic disaster that nearly obliterated Winston's career and psyche. As the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston was the primary architect of the daring but failed naval and amphibious assault on the Dardanelles, which resulted in horrific Allied casualties and a stalemate that horrified the public. The political establishment, particularly the Conservatives who had long resented his rapid rise and perceived arrogance, turned on him with vicious speed, forcing his resignation from the government in May 1915 and casting him into the political wilderness. He chose to exile himself to the mud, rats, and constant death of the Western Front trenches to command a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, believing his life as a statesman was over. During this period, while Winston faced German artillery and the squalor of trench warfare near Ploegsteert, known to the soldiers as Plug Street, Clementine faced the artillery of British society. She remained in London, fighting a ferocious rearguard action against his enemies, refusing to let his name be buried under the weight of the tragedy. She confronted Prime Minister Asquith, managed the hostile press, and navigated the freezing drawing rooms of the elite, maintaining the networks that would eventually allow for his return. More importantly, she served as his psychological lifeline. Her letters to him in the trenches were masterpieces of emotional management, equal parts affection to soothe his depression and steel to stiffen his resolve. She reminded him of his destiny when he saw only failure, acting as the sole tether keeping him connected to the world of power he had lost. Without her unyielding belief in his future during this abyss, Winston likely would have succumbed to the black dog of depression or a German bullet, ending his story as a failed footnote rather than a legend. The interwar period. often romantically referred to as the wilderness years, was in reality a decade-long siege of mental health struggles and financial terror that fell squarely on Clementine's shoulders. As Winston was marginalized by the political mainstream, dismissed as a warmongering relic of the Victorian era he retreated to, Chartwell, their beloved but money pit of a country estate in Kent, which he purchased in 1922 without fully consulting her, a source of immense friction between them. Here he battled profound episodes of clinical depression, which he famously personified as his black dog, a crushing weight that left him lethargic and despondent. This era was also marked by devastating personal tragedy, including the death of their young daughter, Marigold, the Duckadilly, from sepsis in 1921, a blow that nearly shattered Clementine and haunted her for the rest of her life. She bore the immense burden of managing this volatile environment while simultaneously trying to keep them from bankruptcy. Winston's spending habits were atrocious: champagne, cigars, large staffs, and constant expensive renovations to the estate, including building lakes, studios, and heated pools, creating a financial precipice that terrified Clementine, who still carried the scars of her impoverished childhood. She became the family's financial manager, negotiating with bankers, pleading with publishers for advances on his writing, and attempting to impose budgets that he routinely ignored. Simultaneously, she acted as his therapist and emotional anchor. She created a sanctuary at Chartwell where he could paint, write, and build brick walls, activities she actively encouraged to keep his mind occupied and away from the darkness of introspection. She often took solo voyages on cruise ships to preserve her own sanity, recognizing she needed distance to maintain the strength required to support him. It was a thankless, exhausting role that required her to be the adult in the room at all times, preserving his sanity and energy so that when the geopolitical tides turned, he would be mentally capable of answering the call rather than being a broken man hollowed out by debt and despair. As the 1930s progressed and the menacing shadow of Adolf Hitler began to lengthen across Europe, Winston embarked on his lonely, unpopular crusade to warn the world of the Nazi threat. In this phase, Clementine played a critical, often invisible role in refining the weapon that was his voice. Winston was naturally prone to hyperbole, aggressive rhetoric, and an archaic, spaceprint style of speech that could easily alienate the modern listener or be dismissed as the rantings of a bitter alarmist. Clementine, with her sharp ear for the public mood and her intuitive understanding of the British temperament, refused to be a sycophant. She served as his editor-in-chief, reviewing his speeches and newspaper articles with a critical eye. She would tell him plainly when he was being too shrill, too vindictive, or too long-winded, helping him to strip away the excess and sharpen the core message. She understood that to convince a war-weary nation, desperate for peace and appeasement under Neville Chamberlain and the influence of the clived onset of a new threat, he needed to sound prophetic, not hysterical. She coached him on tone and delivery, ensuring that his warnings resonated with the common man as well as the political elite. By tempering his raw, chaotic energy and focusing his arguments, she helped transform him from a political outcast into the voice of the nation's conscience. She was the lens through which his genius was focused into a laser beam of political will, ensuring that when the crisis finally broke, the British people recognized his voice not as a nuisance, but as a clarion call to arms. When war became inevitable in September 1939, Clementine underwent a profound psychological transformation, shifting from the role of a political spouse to that of a wartime consort and essentially the First Lady of the British Empire at war. She did not shrink from the terrifying reality of the coming conflict. Instead, she embraced a stoic, brutal pragmatism. She organized the household logistics to accommodate the erratic 24-hour schedule of a wartime prime minister, managing rationing, security, and the complex movement of their household between Downing Street, the prime minister's country residence at Chequers, and the damp, claustrophobic underground bunkers, known as the Cabinet War Rooms or the Annex. She mentally prepared herself and her children for the possibility of death, invasion, or the total destruction of their way of life, ensuring that gas masks were ready and evacuation protocols were understood. She realized early on that Winston would have to bear the singular weight of the free world's survival, and she determined that her primary duty was to remove every other burden from his path. She protected his sleep at all costs, acting as a fierce guard dog against unnecessary interruptions. She managed his diet to keep his energy up, and she curated the information that reached him to prevent unnecessary distractions. This was not merely domestic management. It was a strategic operation to preserve the mental acuity of the Supreme Commander. By creating a zone of relative stability around him, she allowed him to focus entirely on the defeat of Germany. She compartmentalized her own terror and anxiety, presenting a mask of calm determination that served as a visual cue for the entire government staff, signaling that panic was not an option. Upon Winston's ascension to the prime ministership in May 1940, the unimaginable pressure of the Nazi blitzkrieg and the collapse of France began to twist his temperament into something dangerous. He became tyrannical, rude, and verbally abusive toward his generals, his secretaries, and his cabinet ministers. The atmosphere at 10 Downing Street became toxic, with key staff members whose exhaustion matched his own on the verge of resignation. This potential collapse in personnel threatened to cripple the government at its most critical moment. It was Clementine who intervened, delivering the most important and courageous rebuke of his life. She wrote him a carefully composed, scathing, yet deeply loving letter on June 27, 1940, warning him that he was becoming rough, sarcastic, and overbearing, and that his behavior was alienating the very people he needed to lead. She wrote, "I cannot bear that those who serve the country and yourself should not love you as well as admire and respect you." This was a masterstroke of emotional intelligence. She was the only human being on earth who could speak to the Prime Minister this way without fear of retribution. Her letter pierced his ego, humbled him, and forced a reset in his behavior. By checking his worst instincts, she saved the cohesion of the British war machine, ensuring that he retained the loyalty and affection of his subordinates, rather than ruling through fear, a distinction that was vital for the morale of a democracy fighting against a dictatorship. While Winston directed the grand strategy of the war from maps and bunkers, Clementine felt compelled to share the physical dangers and the visceral reality of the British people. During the London Blitz, when the Luftwaffe rained death upon the city night after night starting in September 1940, she refused to retreat to safety in the country. Instead, she toured the hardest-hit areas of the East End, walking through still smoldering ruins, climbing over shattered glass, and visiting makeshift air raid shelters that were often cold, wet, and unsanitary. She became the compassionate, visible face of the government, listening to the grievances of mothers who had lost their homes and children who were terrified. Crucially, she did not just offer tea and sympathy. She acted as a conduit for hard truth. She returned to Winston and the relevant ministers with angry, detailed reports about the lack of sanitation, the shortage of blankets, and the poor food in the shelters, demanding immediate action. She famously pushed for the opening of the London Underground stations as shelters when the government was hesitant, siding with the people against the bureaucracy. Her presence in the rubble signaled to the population that the leadership was not hiding from the horror, but participating in it. She grounded Winston's high-level strategy in the blood and dust reality of the streets, ensuring that the government never lost touch with the human cost of the war they were asking the people to endure. In a brilliant display of independent diplomatic and administrative power, Clementine launched the Aid to Russia Fund in 1941, despite her own aristocratic background and intense, lifelong dislike of communism. She understood the pragmatic, strategic necessity of keeping the Soviet Union in the war to drain Nazi resources on the Eastern Front. She spearheaded a massive national fundraising campaign, appealing directly to the British public, who were themselves rationing and suffering, to donate money for medical supplies, surgical tools, and warm clothing for Russian soldiers and civilians. The response was overwhelming. Under her leadership, the fund raised nearly £8 million, equating to hundreds of millions in today's currency. A testament to her organizational genius and her ability to mobilize public sentiment through Red Cross Flag Days. She managed the logistics of procurement and shipping, navigating the complex web of wartime bureaucracy and international relations to ensure the aid actually arrived through the treacherous Arctic convoys to Murmansk. Her efforts earned her genuine respect in Moscow, a rare feat for a Westerner, and she was eventually invited to tour the Soviet Union in 1945, where she was greeted as a hero and awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor by Stalin's government. This initiative was entirely her own. It demonstrated that she was a formidable power player capable of executing complex international operations that had a tangible material impact on the war. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a logistical commander in her own right, cementing the fragile alliance between the West and the East through the universal language of humanitarian aid. As the tide of war turned and the Allies began planning the post-war world, Clementine accompanied Winston to the high-stakes wartime conferences in Quebec and Yalta. These summits were pressure cookers of geopolitical tension, bringing together the dying Franklin D. Roosevelt, the paranoid and brutal Joseph Stalin, and the exhausted, emotional Winston Churchill. In this volatile mix, Clementine played the role of the consummate diplomat and humanizer. Her presence at dinners and social events served as a civilizing influence, smoothing over the jagged edges of the leaders' personalities and diffusing conflicts before they could derail negotiations. She knew exactly when to interject with a lighthearted comment and when to remain silent to let Winston press his advantage. Behind the scenes, she was constantly monitoring Winston's failing health. He suffered from pneumonia and heart issues throughout the war, managing his medications and ensuring he conserved his energy for the crucial sessions. She acted as a buffer between him and his own staff, and often between the British delegation and their American and Soviet counterparts. Her grace and intelligence charmed even the stony-faced Soviets, helping to grease the wheels of diplomacy. In these moments, she was more than a wife. She was a key asset to the British delegation, helping to hold the fraying Big Three alliance together long enough to secure the final victory, proving that her soft power was just as essential as the hard power of armies and navies. However, the relentless, grinding demands of the war and Clementine's absolute, unwavering devotion to Winston extracted a terrible price from their family, a cost that is often glossed over in the triumphalist narratives of the era. The sheer volume of emotional and physical energy required to keep the Prime Minister functional meant that Clementine often had to deprioritize her children, Diana, Randolph, Sarah, and Mary. The children grew up in the shadow of a national monument, often feeling secondary to the war effort and their father's career. This dynamic led to strained relationships, deep-seated resentment, and a series of personal tragedies that would plague the younger Churchills for the rest of their lives. Randolph struggled with severe alcoholism, massive gambling debts, and a desperate, unfulfilled need for his father's approval. Diana battled severe mental health issues and eventually took her own life. Sarah struggled with her own demons and failed relationships. Clementine was painfully aware of this sacrifice. She was torn between her maternal instincts and her conviction that her husband's work was the only thing standing between civilization and barbarism. She made the conscious, agonizing choice to prioritize the nation over the nursery, a decision that left deep emotional scars on everyone involved. Additionally, the physical toll on Clementine herself was immense. She suffered from exhaustion, nervous strain, and frequent illnesses, often needing to retreat to health spas to recharge before diving back into the fray. This chapter of her life reveals the brutal human equation of leadership, that the salvation of the many often comes at the destruction of the domestic happiness of the few closest to the center of power. The climax of the war brought a bitter, ironic twist of fate that stunned the world. Amidst the euphoria of V-Day in May 1945, with the Nazis defeated and Winston hailed as the savior of the free world, the British electorate voted him out of office in a landslide defeat in July, favoring the Labour Party led by Clement Attlee. Winston was crushed, viewing the result as a personal betrayal and a rejection of his entire life's struggle. He sank into a deep, bewildered depression, unable to comprehend how the nation he saved could discard him. In this moment of acute shock, it was Clementine who offered the perspective that only she could see. She famously told him it may well be a blessing in disguise. Winston, stinging from the loss, replied, "At the moment it seems quite effectively disguised." Yet Clementine's insight was profound and prophetic. She understood that the war had hollowed him out, that he was physically and mentally spent, and that the task of rebuilding a peacetime. Britain required a different set of skills of social reform and economics that the Labour Party offered. She saw the defeat not as an insult but as a necessary release that might prolong his life. Her ability to detach from the ego of the moment and see the broader arc of their lives showcased her wisdom. She was ready to lay down the burden of history, even if he was not, recognizing that for them to survive as a couple and as individuals, they needed to step off the stage before the lights went out completely. The retirement she longed for was short-lived, and when Winston returned as Prime Minister in 1951, Clementine dutifully stepped back into the breach. However, this final act was marked by a tragic decline that she was forced to manage in secret. Winston was a shadow of his former self, suffering from deafness and a series of strokes that impaired his speech and mobility. In 1953, at a dinner at 10 Downing Street, he suffered a massive stroke that left him paralyzed on one side. Clementine, along with a tight circle of advisors like his physician Lord Moran and son-in-law Christopher Soames, orchestrated a conspiracy of silence, hiding the true extent of his condition from the press, the public, and even the full cabinet to prevent a political crisis. During the height of the Cold War, Clementine became the de facto guardian of the executive power, controlling access to the prime minister and covering for his lapses in concentration. It was a terrifying high-wire act. She had to balance her love for her husband, who desperately wanted to cling to power, with her duty to the country, which needed a capable leader. She lived in constant anxiety that he would collapse in public or fail in a critical moment. She gently but persistently urged him to retire, to leave with his dignity intact, acting as the realist who had to whisper the hard truth that time had finally run out. When he finally resigned in 1955, it was largely due to her influence, ending the long, slow goodbye that she had managed with agonizing grace and secrecy. When the end finally came in January 1965, the death of Winston Churchill was a global event, marking the symbolic end of the British Empire and the heroic age of the 20th century. But amidst the pomp and circumstance of the state funeral, the largest the world had seen, attended by kings, queens, and presidents, under the vast dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, the cameras and the eyes of the world were drawn to the solitary figure of Clementine. Draped in black, she stood with a shattered but unbowed dignity that silenced the millions watching. In that moment, the narrative shifted. The world began to realize that the great man theory was incomplete without her. Historians and the public acknowledged that the Lion of Britain would have lost his roar long ago without her strength. She had been the architect of his resilience, the editor of his voice, and the guardian of his sanity. She had endured the same wars, the same blistering defeats, and the same terrifying heights of power, but she had done so without the applause and often without the recognition. Her presence at the funeral was the final, silent statement of their partnership. She had seen him through to the very end, fulfilling the vow she had made more than half a century earlier. It was as much a tribute to her endurance as it was to his leadership, for she had carried the emotional toll for both of them. In the years following Winston's death, Clementine finally stepped out of the shadows to claim her own place in history. She accepted a life peerage in her own right, becoming Baroness Spencer Churchill of Chartwell, a title that recognized her independent contributions to the nation, particularly her humanitarian work during the wars. She did not fade away. She sold off some of Winston's paintings to secure her financial independence, a final act of practical management, and continued to engage with the public until her own death in December 1977. She lived for another 12 years without him, a period where she finally belonged only to herself, though she remained the fierce guardian of Winston's memory. Her life story forces a rewriting of the Churchill legend. It proves that she was never just the woman behind the man in the cliched sense. She was the structural integrity of the entire Churchillian edifice. She was a co-author of history who sacrificed her own potential to ensure the survival of freedom. A woman who possessed the unique strength required to tame, focus, and sustain a force of nature. In the final estimation, Clementine Churchill stands not in her husband's shadow, but alongside him, a giant in her own right who held the world together while her husband saved it.